My Bondage and My Freedom. Chapter 18. New Relations and Duties. My term of actual service to Mr. Edward Covey ended on Christmas Day, 1834. I gladly left the snakish Covey, although he was now as gentle as a lamb. My home for the year 1835 was already secured. My next master was already selected. This was always more or less excitement about the matter of changing hands. But I had become somewhat reckless. I cared very little into whose hands I fell. I meant to fight my way. Despite of Covey, too, the report got abroad that I was hard to whip, that I was guilty of kicking back, that though generally a good-tempered Negro, I sometimes got the devil in me. These sayings were rife in Talbot County, and they distinguished me among my servile brethren. Slaves, generally, will fight each other, and die at each other's hands. But there are few who are not held in awe by a white man, trained from the cradle up to think and feel that their masters are superior, and invested with a sort of sacredness. There are few who can outgrow or rise above the control which that sentiment exercises. I had now shaken free from it, and the thing was known. One bad sheep will spoil a whole flock. Among the slaves, I was a bad sheep. I hated slavery, slaveholders, and all pertaining to them, and I did not fail to inspire others with the same feeling, wherever and whenever opportunity was presented. This made me a marked lad among the slaves, and a suspected one among the slaveholders. Knowledge of my ability to read and write got pretty widely spread, which was very much against me. The days between Christmas Day and New Year's are allowed the slaves as holidays. During these days all regular work are suspended, and there was nothing to do but to keep fires and look after the stock. This time was regarded as our own, by the grace of our masters, and we therefore used it, or abused it, as we pleased. Those who had families at a distance were now expected to visit them, and to spend with them the entire week. The younger slaves, or the unmarried ones, were expected to see to the cattle, and attend to incidental duties at home. The holidays were variously spent. The sober, thinking, and industrious ones of our number would employ themselves in manufacturing corn brooms, mats, horse collars, and baskets, and some of these were very well made. Another class spent their time in hunting possums, coons, rabbits, and other game, but the majority spent the holidays in sport, ball-playing, wrestling, boxing, running foot races, dancing, and drinking whiskey, and this latter mode of spending the time was generally most agreeable to their masters. A slave who had worked during the holiday was thought by his master undeserving of holidays. Such a one had rejected the favor of his master. There was in the simple act of continued work an accusation against slaves, and a slave could not help thinking that if he made $3 during the holidays, he might make 300 during the year. Not to be drunk during the holidays was disgraceful, and he was esteemed a lazy and improvident man, who could not afford to drink whiskey during Christmas. The fiddling, dancing, and jubilee beating was going in all directions. This latter performance is strictly Southern. It supplies the place of a violin, or of other musical instruments, and is played so easily that almost every has its juba bearer. The performer improvises as he beats, and sings his merry songs, so ordering the words as to have them fall pat with the movement of his hands, among a mass of nonsense and wide frolic. Once in a while a sharp hit is given to the meanness of slaveholders. Take the following for an example. We raise the wheat, they give us the corn. We break the bread, they give us the crust. We sift the meal, they give us the husk. We peel the meat, they give us the skin. And that's the way they takes us in. We skim the pot, they give us the liquor. They say that's good enough for a nigger. Walk over, Tom buttered the fat. Poor nigger, you can't get over that. Walk over. This is not a bad summary of the palpable injustice and fraud of slavery, giving, as it does, to the lazy and idle, the comforts which God designed should be given solely to the honest laborer, but to the holidays. Judging from one observation and experience, I believe these holidays to be among the most effective means in the hands of slaveholders of keeping down the spirit of insurrection among the slaves. To enslave men successfully and safely, it is necessary to have their minds occupied with thoughts and aspirations short of the liberty of which they are deprived. A certain degree of attainable good must be kept before them. These holidays serve the purpose of keeping the minds of the slaves occupied with a prospective pleasure within the limits of slavery. The young man can go a-wooing, the married man can visit his wife, the father and mother can see their children, and the industrious and money-loving can make a few dollars. The great wrestler can win laurels, young people can meet and enjoy each other's society, and the drunken man can get plenty of whiskey, and the religious man can hold prayer meetings, preach, and pray and exhort during the holidays. Before the holidays, these are pleasures in prospect. After the holidays, they become pleasures of memory, and they serve to keep out thoughts and wishes of a more dangerous character. Were slaveholders at once to abandon the practice of allowing their slaves these liberties, periodically and to keep them, the year round, closely confined to the narrow circle of their homes, I doubt not that the South would blaze with insurrections. These holidays are conductors or safety valves to carry off the explosive elements inseparable from the human mind, when reduced to the condition of slavery. But for these the rigors of bondage would become too severe for endurance, and the slave would be forced up to dangerous desperation. Woe to the slaveholder when he undertakes to hinder or to prevent the operation of these electric conductors. A succession of earthquakes would be less destructive than the insurrectionary fires which would be sure to burst forth in different parts of the South from such an interference. Thus the holidays become part and parcel of the gross fraud, wrongs, and inhumanity of slavery. Ostensibly they are institutions of benevolence, designed to mitigate the rigors of slave life, but practically they are a fraud, instituted by human selfishness, the better to secure the ends of injustice and oppression. The slave's happiness is not the end that is sought, but rather the master's safety. It is not from a genuine unconcern for the slave's labor that a cessation from labor is allowed, but from a prudent regard to the safety of the slave's system. I am strengthened in this opinion by the fact that most slaveholders like to have their slaves spend the holidays in such a manner to be of no real benefit to the slaves. It is plain that everything like rational enjoyment among the slaves is frowned upon. Not only those wild and low sports peculiar to semi-civilized people are encouraged, but all the licenses allowed appears to have no other object than to disgust the slaves with their temporary freedom, and to make them as glad to return to the work as they were to leaving it, by plunging them into exhausting depths of drunkenness and dissipation. This effect is almost certain to follow. I have known slaveholders resort to cunning tricks, with a view of getting their slaves deplorably drunk. A usual plan is to make bets on a slave that he can drink more whiskey than any other, and so to induce a rivalry among them, for the mastery in this degradation. The scenes brought about in this way were often scandalous and loathsome in the extreme. Whole multitudes might be found stretched out in brutal drunkenness, at once helpless and disgusting. Thus, when the slaves ask for a few hours of virtuous freedom, his cunning master takes advantage of his ignorance, and cheers him with a dose of vicious and revolting dissipation, artfully labelled with the name of liberty. We were induced to drink, among the rest, and when the holidays were over, we all staggered up from our filth and our wallowing, took a long breath, and went away to our various fields of work, feeling, upon the whole, rather glad to go from that which our masters artfully deceived us into the belief was freedom, back again into the arms of slavery. It is not what we had taken it to be, nor what it must have been, had it not been abused by us. It was about as well to be a slave to master as to be a slave to rum and whiskey. I am the more induced to take this view of the holiday system, adopted by slaveholders, from what I know of their treatment of slaves. In regarding to other things, It is the commonest thing for them to try to disgust their slaves with what they do not want them to have or to enjoy. A slave, for instance, likes molasses. He steals some. To cure him of the taste of it, his master, in many cases, will go away to town and buy a large quantity of the poorest of quality, and set it before his slave, and with whip in hand compel him to eat it, and till the poor fellow is made to sicken at the very thought of molasses. The same course is often adopted to cure slaves of the disagreeable and inconvenient practice of asking for more food, when their allowance has failed them. The same disgusting process works well, too, in other things. I need not cite them. When a slave is drunk, the slaveholder has no fear that he will plan an insurrection, no fear that he will escape to the north. It is the sober, thinking slave who is dangerous, and needs the vigilance of his master to keep him a slave. But again, to proceed with my narrative. On the 1st of January, 1835, I proceeded from St. Michael's to Mr. William Freeland's, my new home. Mr. Freeland lived only 3 miles from St. Michael's, on an old worn-out farm, which required much labor to restore to anything like a self-supporting establishment. I was not long in finding Mr. Freeland to be a very different man from Mr. Covey. Though not rich, Mr. Freeland was what may be called a well-bred Southern gentleman, as different from Covey as a well-trained and hardened Negro breaker is from the best specimen of the first families of the South. Though Freeland was a slaveholder, and shared the many vices of his class, he seemed alive to the sentiment of honor. He did have a sense of justice, and a few feelings of humanity. He was fretful, impulsive, and passionate. But I must do him the justice to say he was free from the mean and selfish characteristics which distinguished the creature from which I had now happily escaped. He was open, frank, imperative, and practised no concealments, disdaining to play the spy. In all this he was the opposite of the crafty Covey. Among the many advantages gained in my change from Covey to Freeland, startling as the statement may be, was the fact that the latter gentleman made no profession of religion. I assert most unhesitatingly that the religion of the South, as I have observed and proved it, is a mere covering for their horrid crimes, the justifier of their most appalling barbarity, and a sanctifier of their most hateful frauds, and a secure shelter under which the darkest, foulest, grossest, and the most infernal abominations fester and flourish. Were I again to be reduced to the condition of a slave next to that calamity, I should regard the fact of being the slave of a religious slaveholder the greatest that could befall me. Of all slaveholders with whom I have ever met, religious slaveholders are always the worst. I have found them almost invariably the vilest, meanest, and basest of their class. Exceptions there may be, but this is true of the religious slaveholders as a class. It is not for me to explain that fact. Others may do that. I simply state it as a fact, and leave those theological and psychological inquiry, which it raises, to be cited by others more competent than myself. Religious slaveholders, like religious persecutors, are ever the extreme in their malice and violence. Very near my new home, on an adjoining farm, there lived the Reverend Daniel Whedon. He was both pious and cruel after the real Covey pattern. Mr. Whedon was a local preacher of the Protestant Methodist persuasion, and a most zealous supporter of the ordinances of religion, generally. This Whedon owned a woman called Seal, who is a standing proof of his mercilessness. Poor Seal's back, always scantily clothed, was kept literally raw by the lash of his religious man and this gospel minister, the most notoriously wicked man, so called in distinction from church members, could hire hands more easily than this brute. When sent out to find a home, a slave would never enter the gates of the preacher Whedon, while a sinful sinner needed a hand. Behave ill or behave well, it is the known maxim of Whedon. That is the duty of a master to use the lash. If for no other reason, he contended that this was essential to remind a slave of his condition, and of his master's truly deemed authority. The good slave must be whipped to be kept good, and the bad slave must be whipped to be made good. Such was Whedon's theory, and such was his practice. The back of his slave woman will, in the judgment, be that swiftest witness against him. While I am starting particular cases, I might as well immortalize another of my neighbors by calling him by name and putting him down in print. He did not think that Achille was near taking notes, and will, doubtlessly, feel quite angry at having his character touched off in the ragged style of a slave's pen. I beg to introduce the reader to a Reverend Rigby Hopkins, for Mr. Hopkins resides between Easton and St. Michael's, in Talbot County, Maryland. The severity of this man made him a perfect terror to the slaves of his neighborhood. The peculiar feature of his government was his system of whipping slaves, as he said, in advance of deserving it. He always managed to have 1 or 2 slaves to whip on a Monday morning, so as to start his hand at their work. Under the inspiration of a new assurance on Monday that his preaching about kindness, mercy, and brotherly love and the like on Sunday did not interfere with or prevent him from establishing his authority by the cowskin whip. He seemed to wish to assure them that his tears over the poor lost and ruined sinners, and his pity for them, did not reach to the blacks who tilled his fields. This saintly Hopkins used to boast that he was the best hand to manage a Negro in the county. He whipped for the smallest of offenses, by way of preventing the commissions of much larger ones. The reader might imagine a difficulty in finding faults enough for such frequent whipping, but this is because you have no idea how easy a matter it is to offend a man who is on the lookout for offenses. The man, unaccustomed to slaveholding, would be astonished to observe how many forgivable offenses there are in the slaveholder's catalogue of crimes, and how easy it is to commit any one of them, even when the slave least intends it. A slaveholder bent on finding fault will hatch up a dozen a day, if he chooses to do so, and each of these shall be a punishable description. A mere look, a word, a motion, a mistake, an accident, or even a want of power, are all matters for which a slave may be whipped at any time. Does a slave look dissatisfied with their condition? It is said that he has the devil in him, and it must be whipped out. Does he answer loudly when spoken to by his master, in an air of self-consciousness? Oh, then he must be taken down a buttonhole lower, by the lash, well laid on. Does he forget and omit to pull off his hat when approaching a white person? Well, then he must or may be whipped for his bad manners. Does he ever venture to vindicate his conduct when harshly and unjustly accused? Well, then he is guilty of impudence, one of the greatest crimes in the social catalogue of Southern society. To allow a slave to escape punishment, who has impudently attempted to exculpate himself from the unjust charges preferred against him by some white person, is to be guilty of the dereliction of duty. Does a slave ever venture to suggest a better way of doing a thing? Well, he is altogether too officious or wise of what is written, and he deserves, even if he does not get, a flogging for this presumption. Does he, while plowing, break a plow? Or while hoeing, break the plow? Or while chopping, an axe chip? No matter what, there are imperfections of the implement broken, or the natural liabilities for breaking. The slave must be whipped for this carelessness, and the reverend slaveholder could always find something of this sort to justify him in using the lash several times during his week. Hopkins, like Covey and Whedon, were shunned by slaves who had the privilege, as many had, of finding their own masters at the end of each year, and yet there was not a man in all the section of the country who made a louder profession of his religion than did a Mr. Rigby Hopkins. But to continue the thread of my original story, through my experience when at Mr. William Freeland's, my poor weather-beaten bark now reached smoother water and gentler breezes. My stormy life at Covey's had been of service to me. The things which would have seemed very hard, had I gone direct to Mr. Freeland's from the home of a Master Thomas, were now, after all the hardships at Covey's, trifles as light as the air. I was still a field hand, and had come to prefer the severe labor of the field to the enervating duties of a house servant. I had become quite large and strong, and had begun to take pride in the fact that I could do as much hard work as some of the older men. There is a much rivalry among slaves at times as to which can do the most work, and masters generally seek to promote this rivalry. But some of us are too wise to race with each other for very long. Such racing, we had the sagacity to see, was not likely to pay. We had our times for measuring each other's strengths, but we knew too much to keep up the competition so long as to produce an extraordinary day's work. We knew that, if by extraordinary exertion a large quantity of work was done in a single day, this fact, becoming known to the master, might lead him to start to require the same amount every day, and this thought was enough to bring us to a dead halt when ever so much excited for a race. At Mr. Freeland's my condition was every way improved. I was no longer the poor scapegoat that I was when at Covey's, where every wrong thing done was saddled upon me, and where other slaves were whipped over my shoulders. Mr. Freeland was too just a man thus to impose upon me or upon anyone else. It is quite usual to make one slave the object of a special abuse, and to beat him often, within a view to effect it upon others, rather than with any exception that the slave whipped will be improved by it. But the man with whom I now was could descend to no such meanness and wickedness. Every man here was held individually responsible for his own conduct. This was a vast improvement on the rule at Covey's. There I was the general pack-horse. Bill Smith was protected by a positive prohibition made by his own rich master, and the command of the rich slaveholder is law to the poor one. Hughes was favored because of his relationship to Covey, and the hands hired temporarily escaped flogging, except as they got it over my poor shoulders. Of course, this comparison refers to the time when Covey could whip me. Mr. Freeland, like Mr. Covey, gave his hands enough to eat, but unlike Mr. Covey, he gave them time to take their meals. He worked us hard during the day, but gave us the night for rest, another advantage to be set to the credit of the sinner, as against that of the saint. We are seldom in the field after dark in the evening, or ever before sunrise in the morning. Our implements of husbandry were the most improved pattern, and much superior to those of Covey's. Notwithstanding the improvised condition which was now mine, and the many advantages I had gained by my new home and my new master, I was still restless and discontent. I was about as hard to please by a master as is by a slave. The freedom from bodily torture and unceasing labor had given my mind an increased sensibility, and imparted to it a greater activity. I was not yet exactly in right relations. Howbeit, that was not first which is spiritual, but that which is natural, and afterwards that which is spiritual. When entombed at Covey's, shrouded in darkness and physical wretchedness, temporal well-being was the grand desideratum. But temporal once supplied, the spirit puts in its claims. Beat and cuff your slave, keep him hungry and spiritless, and he will follow the chain of his master like a dog. But if you feed and clothe him well, work him moderately, and surround him with physical comfort, the dreams of freedom start to intrude. Give him a bad master, and he aspires to a good master. Give him a good master, and he soon wishes to become his own master. Such is human nature. You may hurl a man so low, beneath the level of his kind, that he loses all just ideas of his natural position. But elevate him a little, and the clear conception of rights arises to a life and power, and leads him onward. Thus elevated a little at Freeland's, the dream also called into being by the good man, Father Lawson, when in Baltimore, began to visit me, and shoots from the tree of liberty began to put forth tender buds, and dim hopes of the future began to dawn. I found myself in congenial society at Mr. Freeland's. There were Henry Harris, John Harris, Handy Cadwell, and Sandy Jenkins. Henry and John were brothers, and belonged to Mr. Freeland. They were both remarkably bright and intelligent, though neither of them could read. Now for mischief. I had not been long at Freeland's before I was up to my old trick. I early began to address my companions on the subjects of education and the advantages of intelligence over ignorance, and as far as I dared, I tried to show the agency of ignorance in keeping men in slavery. Webster's spelling book and the Columbian Orator were looked into again. As summer came on, and the long Sabbath days stretched themselves over our idleness, I became uneasy, and wanted a Sabbath school in which to exercise my gifts, and to impart the little knowledge of letters which I possessed to my brother slaves. A house was hardly necessary in the summer time. I could hold my school under the shade of an old oak tree, as well as anywhere else. The thing was to get the scholars, and to have them thoroughly imbued with a desire to learn. 2 such boys were quickly secured in Henry and John, and from them the contagion spread. I was not long bringing around me 20 or 30 young men, who enrolled themselves gladly in my Sabbath school, and were willing to meet me regularly, under the trees or elsewhere, for the purposes of learning to read. It was surprising with what ease they provided themselves with spelling books. These were mostly the cast-off books of their own young masters or mistresses. I taught at first on our own farm, and all were impressed with the necessity of keeping the matter as private as possible, for the fate of the St. Michael's attempt was quite notorious, and fresh in the minds of all. Our pious masters at St. Michael's must not know that a few of their dusky brothers were learning to read the Word of God, lest they should come down upon us with a lash and chain. We might have met to drink whiskey, to wrestle, fight, and to do other unseemly things, with no fear of any interruption from those saints or sinners of St. Michael's. But to meet for the purpose of improving our minds and hearts, by learning to read the sacred Scriptures, was esteemed a most dangerous nuisance to be instantly stopped. The slaveholders of St. Michael's, like slaveholders elsewhere, would always prefer to see their slaves engaged in degrading sports, rather than to see them acting like moral and accountable beings. Had anyone asked a religious white man in St. Michael's 20 years ago the names of 3 men in that town, whose lives were most often the pattern of our Lord and Master Jesus Christ, the first 3 would have been as followed: Garrison West, class leader; Wright Fairbanks, class leader; and Thomas Auld, class leader. And yet these were men who ferociously rushed in upon my Sabbath school at St. Michael's, armed with mob-like missiles, and I must say I thought him a Christian until he took part in blood by the lash. This same Garrison West was my class leader, and I must say I thought him a Christian until he took part in breaking up my school. He led me no more after that. The plea for this outrage was then, as it is now, and at all times, the danger to good order. If the slaves learned to read, they would learn something else, and something worse. The peace of slavery would be disturbed. Slave rule would be endangered. I leave the reader to characterize a system which is endangered by such causes. I do not dispute the soundness of the reasoning. It is perfectly sound, and if slavery be right, Sabbath schools for teaching slaves to read the Bible are wrong, and ought to be put down. These Christian class leaders were, to this extent, consistent. They had settled the question, that slavery is right, and by that standard they determined that Sabbath schools are wrong. To be sure, they were Protestant, and held the great Protestant right of every man to search the Scriptures for themselves. But then, to all general rules, there are exceptions. Oh, how convenient! What crimes may not be kidded under the doctrine of the last remark? But, my dear class-leading Methodist brethren, do not condense to give me a reason for breaking up the Sabbath school of St. Michael's. It was enough that they had determined upon its instruction. I am, however, digressing. After getting the school cleverly into operation, the second time holding it in the woods, behind the barn, and in the shade of trees, I succeeded in inducing a free colored man, who lived several miles from our home, to permit me to hold my school in a room at his house. He very kindly gave me this liberty, but he incurred much peril in doing so, for this assemblage was an unlawful one. I shall not mention here the name of this man, for it might even now subject him to persecution, although the offences were committed more than 20 years ago. I had at one time more than 40 scholars, all of the right sort. Many of them succeeded in learning to read. I have met several slaves from Maryland, who were once my scholars, who had obtained their freedom. I doubt not partly in consequence of the ideas imparted to them within that school. I have had various employments during my short life, but I look back to none with more satisfaction to that afforded by my Sunday school. An attachment deep and lasting sprung up between me and my persecuted pupils, which made parting for them intensely grievous. And when I think that most of those clear, dear souls are yet shut up in this abject thraldom, I am overwhelmed with grief. Besides my Sunday school, I devoted 3 evenings a week to my fellow slaves. During the winter, let the reader reflect upon the fact that in this Christian county, men and women are hiding from professors of religion, in barns, in woods, in fields, in order to learn to read the Holy Bible. Those dear souls who came to my Sabbath school came not because it was popular or reputable to attend such a place, for they came under the liability of having 40 stripes laid upon their naked backs. Every moment they spent in my school, they were under this terrible liability, and in this respect I was a sharer with them. Their minds had been cramped and starved by their cruel masters, and the light of education had been completely excluded, and their hard earnings had been taken to educate their own masters' children. I felt a delight in circumventing these tyrants, and in blessing the victims of their curses. The year at Mr. Freeland's passed off very smoothly, to the outward seeming. Not a blow was given me during the whole year. To the credit of Mr. Freeland, irreligious though he was, it must be stated that he was the best master I ever had, until I became my own master, and assumed by myself, as I had a right to do, the responsibility of my own existence, and the exercise of my own powers. For much of the happiness, or absence of misery, with which I possessed this year with Mr. Freeman, I am indebted to the genial temper and ardent friendship of my brother slaves. They were, every one of them, mainly generous and brave. Yes, I say they were brave, and I will add, fine-looking. It is seldom the lot of mortals to have truer and better friends than were the slaves upon this farm. It is not uncommon to charge slaves with great treachery toward each other, and to believe them incapable of confiding in one another. But I must say that I never loved, esteemed, or confided in men more than I did in these. They were as true as steel, and no band of brothers could have been more loving. There were no mean advantages taken over each other, as is sometimes the case where slaves are situated as we were. There was no tattling, no giving each other bad names to Mr. Freeland, and no elevating one at the expense of the other. We never undertook to do anything of any importance which was likely to affect each other, without mutual consultation. We were generally a unit, and we moved together. Thoughts and sentiments were exchanged between us, which might well be called very incendiary by oppressors and tyrants. And perhaps the time has not even now come when it is safe to unfold all the flying suggestions which arise in the minds of intelligent slaves. Several of my friends and brothers, if yet alive, are still in some part of the house of bondage, and though 20 years have passed away, the suspicious malice of slavery might punish them for even listening to my thoughts. The slaveholder, be them kind or cruel, is a slaveholder still, the every hour a violator of the just and inalienable rights of man, and he is, therefore, every hour silently whetting the knife of vengeance for his own throat. He never lisps a syllable in commendation of the fathers of this republic, nor denounces any attempted oppression of himself, without inviting the knife again to his own throat, and asserting the rights of rebellion for his own slaves. The year is ended, and we are now in the midst of the Christmas holidays, which were kept this year's last, according to the general description previously given.